Okay, so let's talk about DIYing. What does it mean to kind of secure, connect, and observe an application if we're not going to use any fundamental infrastructure to do it, right? So we have an application, right, that we have built. Let's call it A, right? And there's another application, B, which we've also built, and we'll call it B. Well, so I need something that's going to secure communications to B. And there's nothing in this ecosystem or infrastructure that's going to help me do that, which means I'm going to have to go and put a library in A that implements secure communications. Let's say I do something like I implement TLS. And that means that B also has to implement TLS because this is reciprocal. And I also want to do observability, right? So I'm going to put an observability library in here. Let's say I put in an OTel library. And I do the same thing over here, right? Because I need both perspectives of the traffic to get a uniform view of what's going on. And I want to be able to control connectivity, so I'm also going to put in some library that gives me, let's say, something like HTTP routing. Okay, so now I've built 3 libraries into my application A, and I've done the same thing in B. Well, what if A and B are written in different programming languages? Well, that means I have to use different libraries in B than I use in A. And how many programming languages do you use in your organization? Well, depending on how long your organization's been around and how big it is, that number could actually be very large, right? So we have language diversity is a major downside of this problem. And it's very hard to get libraries in the languages that guarantee and give you exactly the same behavioral semantics for the same feature. So yes, TLS being an internet standard, you can probably get libraries in different languages that work the same way. But for HTTP routing or even for open telemetry or something like that, it's actually quite hard to get libraries that give you consistency, right? So we have this big problem of library consistency. Now let's say there's a bug in one of these libraries. What has to happen? Well, I have to roll out an update to every application that library was used in, right? So I have a library maintenance problem. And that can actually get very complicated, right? If the library is widely used, then that might mean I have to roll out an update to every application in my fleet, which means I have to know how to rebuild it, and all the CI/CD pipelines and everything else that go behind that have to function. In organizations that have been around a long time, there are actually applications out there that have been built that, you know, don't have frequent updates. They maybe haven't released a new binary in a year. That presents its own problems from a security standpoint, but in general, right, the older your applications are, the less likely it is and the harder it is to push out frequent updates to them. We also have a dynamism problem. If I want to dynamically reconfigure these things, let's say to change the HTTP routing, well, if all of that configuration is embedded as code inside the application, I also have to go and update the application to change the policy, right, to change the routing that it does. If I want to build a system that's going to dynamically configure it, then I actually have to build some kind of control plane to push policy to that. Well, that can start to become really quite complicated, right? And that's now a bespoke piece of infrastructure that I've had to build and maintain for myself, for my company, that pushes configuration out to a fleet of applications. And that has to work everywhere my applications run. And that begins to create a lot of the complexity. And at this point, you're kind of transitioning to the point at which you'd rather just have an acquired or use existing infrastructure or some off-the-shelf solution rather than trying to build effectively a model of a network control plane. And so these are some of the primary problems we see with DIYing. There are lots and lots of other ones, but mostly they boil down to the limitations in capability, and the maintenance problems really start to accrete the more diverse and inconsistent your platform is, the harder and harder this becomes. And what we generally see is that while some companies have started out with this, as they grow or, you know, they begin to adopt other solutions, they really just can't continue to maintain this and have to move on to something more advanced or more capable. So this is the DIY solution. So now let's talk about something at kind of L3 layer.